Looking back on it now, with Max curled up at my feet in the evening light, I sometimes wonder if everything started that day. I first noticed something wasn't right about the old storage unit at the county auction, but maybe it began much earlier than that. Maybe it began when I was 8 years old, watching my grandfather's calloused hands work magic on a broken tractor engine in the Georgia heat, teaching me that sometimes you have to dig deeper than what's visible on the surface to find what really matters. My name is Robert Mitchell, and I'm 67 years old now, grandfather to 3 beautiful children who call me Papa Bob. I grew up in a small town outside Macon, where my daddy worked double shifts at the textile mill, and my mama kept house for 3 boys who tracked mud through her kitchen more times than she could count. We didn't have much money, but we had something more valuable. We had integrity. My grandfather, Papa Joe, was the kind of man who'd drive 20 miles out of his way to return a wallet he found, even if it meant being late for supper. He taught me that a man's word is his bond, and that sometimes doing the right thing costs you more than you can afford, but you do it anyway because that's what separates the men from the boys. Papa Joe had this old bloodhound named Rusty, and that dog could smell trouble from 3 counties away. I learned early that dogs know things we don't, that they can sense dishonesty in a person's scent, fear in their posture, danger in places that look perfectly safe to human eyes. When Rusty would growl low in his throat at certain folks who came around the farm, Papa Joe would listen. "Dogs don't lie, Bobby," he'd tell me, scratching behind Rusty's ears. "They don't have any reason to. When a good dog tells you something, you'd better pay attention." Those summers working alongside Papa Joe, learning to read the signs in busted machinery, in storm clouds gathering on the horizon, in the way animals behaved before something big was about to happen, those lessons shaped me into the man I became. He taught me patience, how to wait and watch and think before acting. He taught me that most problems have solutions if you're willing to get your hands dirty and your back sore finding them. And he taught me that sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in the most unlikely places. When I was 19, I married Sarah Beth Coleman, a girl with auburn hair and freckles who could make cornbread so good it would make you weep. We moved to a little house outside Valdosta, where I got work at a machine shop, and she taught 2nd grade at the elementary school. Our first son, James, came along 2 years later, followed by Michael and then our daughter, Emma. Sarah Beth had a way with growing things, vegetables, flowers, children, and she could stretch a dollar further than seemed humanly possible. We weren't wealthy by any measure, but we were rich in the ways that mattered. Those were good years, years of little league games and school plays and family barbecues in our backyard. I taught my boys how to change oil, how to throw a curveball, how to treat their sister and their mother with respect. Sarah Beth taught them how to read, how to pray, how to see the beauty in small things like fireflies on summer evenings. We went to church on Sundays, helped our neighbors when they needed it, and saved what little we could for the children's college funds. When James turned 16, we got him his first car, a beat-up Chevy that needed more work than it was worth, but it ran, and it was his. I spent hours in our garage with both boys, teaching them the satisfaction of fixing something with their own hands, the pride that comes from solving problems through patience and determination. Michael had a natural gift for mechanical work, while James was more interested in the business side of things. Emma, bright as a penny, was already talking about becoming a veterinarian because she loved animals more than anything else in the world. It was Emma who first convinced us to get Max. She was 14, and she'd been campaigning for a dog for 3 years running. Max was just a puppy then, all paws and ears, a German Shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes and a coat like burnished copper. Sarah Beth wasn't entirely convinced we needed another mouth to feed, but one look at the way that dog and Emma took to each other, and she was outvoted. Max became part of our family in a way that felt as natural as breathing. As the children grew older and started families of their own, Max became my constant companion. When Sarah Beth passed away 4 years ago, after a brief but fierce battle with cancer, Max seemed to understand that his job had changed. He stayed closer to me, watched me more carefully, offered the kind of silent comfort that only a good dog can provide. During those first dark months after Sarah Beth's funeral, when the house felt too quiet and the future looked too empty, Max would rest his head on my knee and remind me, without saying a word, that I still had purpose in this world. My grandson, Tommy, James's boy, was especially fond of Max. At 8 years old, Tommy had inherited his great-great-grandfather's curiosity and his great-grandfather's patience. He'd spend hours in my workshop, asking questions about every tool, every project, every story I'd tell him about the old days. Max would lie at Tommy's feet while he worked on small projects, as if the dog understood that this boy needed watching over, needed guidance in the ancient art of working with your hands. Last spring, Tommy came running into the house with dirt under his fingernails and excitement lighting up his face. "Papa Bob," he said, tugging on my sleeve, "me and Max found something weird in the backyard. There's this metal thing buried under the old oak tree, and Max won't stop digging at it." I followed him outside, Max trotting alongside us with his tail wagging and his nose twitching. Sure enough, there was a disturbed patch of earth near the base of the massive oak tree that had been standing in our backyard since before the house was built. Max immediately went to the spot and began pawing at the ground again, whining softly in the way he did when he was trying to tell me something important. "It's probably just an old pipe or something," I told Tommy, but something about Max's behavior nagged at me. This wasn't his usual playful digging. This was focused, urgent, almost anxious. I knelt down and brushed away some of the loose soil with my hands, feeling the cool earth give way beneath my fingers. What I found wasn't a pipe. It was the corner of something metallic, something that had been deliberately buried and covered over, something that didn't belong in my backyard. The metal was old, but not rusty, painted a dull green that reminded me of military equipment I'd seen in old war movies. Max pressed his nose to the exposed corner and whined again, looking up at me with those intelligent brown eyes as if to say, "I told you this was important." "What is it, Papa Bob?" Tommy asked, leaning over my shoulder. "I don't rightly know, son," I said, brushing more dirt away, "but I think we'd better find out." Over the next few hours, working carefully with hand tools so we wouldn't damage whatever was buried beneath the tree, Tommy, Max and I uncovered what appeared to be a metal storage box, roughly the size of a footlocker. It was heavy, heavier than it looked, and it was sealed with a combination lock that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The whole thing had been wrapped in heavy plastic before being buried, which explained why it was in such good condition, despite obviously having been in the ground for years. As we worked, Max never left our side. He seemed almost protective of our discovery, positioning himself between us and the house, watching the street as if he expected someone to come and try to stop us. His behavior was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him, and it made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain. "Should we try to open it?" Tommy asked, running his small hands over the smooth metal surface. I looked at the box, then at Max, then at my grandson's eager face. Something told me that whatever was inside this box, whatever secrets it held, they were secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The location wasn't random. It was buried beneath the oldest tree on the property, in a spot that would be difficult to find unless you knew exactly where to look. Someone had chosen this location carefully, deliberately. "I think," I said slowly, "we'd better get this cleaned up and figure out exactly what we've got here before we go opening anything." That evening, after Tommy had gone home with promises to keep our discovery secret for now, I sat in my garage, staring at the metal box we'd placed on my workbench. Max lay at my feet, but he wasn't relaxed. His ears were pricked forward, and every few minutes he'd lift his head and look toward the box as if he could hear something coming from inside it. I'd lived in this house for 43 years. Sarah Beth and I had bought it from an elderly widow named Mrs. Henderson, who had lived here with her husband for 30 years before that. Before the Hendersons, according to the county records, the property had belonged to a man named Earl Mackenzie, who'd bought the land in 1952 and built the house himself. Earl had been a veteran, Mrs. Henderson had told us when we bought the place, though she'd never known much about his service or what had happened to him after he sold the house and moved away. Sitting there in the quiet garage, with only the sound of Max's breathing and the distant hum of traffic on the county road, I found myself thinking about Earl Mackenzie for the first time in decades. What kind of man buries a heavy metal box beneath an oak tree? What kind of secrets was he hiding? And why was Max, my faithful companion, who'd never shown fear of anything in his life, acting like that box contained something dangerous? The combination lock was a standard 3-number setup, the kind you might find on a school locker or a gym bag, but the metal around it was worn smooth in places, as if someone had handled it frequently over many years. There were scratches near the lock, faint marks that might have been from someone trying to force it open, or simply the normal wear and tear of regular use. I spent the rest of that evening researching Earl Mackenzie online, finding very little information about the man who'd once called my house home. There was a record of his military service. He'd been a sergeant in the army during World War II, stationed in Europe from 1943 to 1945. After the war, he'd worked various jobs around Valdosta, never married, and had apparently lived a quiet, unremarkable life until he'd sold the house in 1978 and disappeared from the public record. But there was something about the dates that bothered me. Earl had bought this property in 1952, 7 years after the war ended. He'd lived here alone for 26 years before selling and moving on. That was a long time for a man to keep secrets buried in his backyard, a long time to protect something he considered valuable or dangerous enough to hide. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly drawn to that garage, to that box sitting on my workbench, like a silent question waiting for an answer. Max seemed to sense my preoccupation. He'd follow me to the garage and position himself between me and the box, watching my every move, with an intensity that was both comforting and unsettling. Tommy came by after school every day, full of questions and theories about what might be inside our mysterious discovery. His young imagination ran wild with possibilities: treasure, secret documents, maybe even evidence of some long-forgotten crime. I tried to temper his excitement with caution, but the truth was I was just as curious as he was. "Papa Bob," he said one afternoon as we sat in the garage, both of us staring at the box, "what if it's something bad? What if Mr. Earl was a bad man who did bad things?" It was a question I'd been asking myself, and I didn't have a good answer. "Well, son," I said, "sometimes people do things that seem bad from the outside, but they have good reasons. And sometimes good people get mixed up in bad situations through no fault of their own. Until we know what's in that box, we can't judge Earl Mackenzie." "But Max doesn't like it," Tommy observed, and he was right. Max had barely taken his eyes off the box since we'd brought it inside. He wasn't aggressive toward it exactly, but he was wary, alert, protective. "No," I agreed. "Max doesn't like it. And Max is usually right about these things." That night, I called my son James and told him about our discovery. As an adult, he deserved to know what we'd found on the property where his children played, where his mother was buried, where his family gathered for holidays and birthdays. "Dad," he said after I'd finished explaining, "maybe you should call the police. If this Earl guy buried something in the yard, it might be evidence of a crime. You could get in trouble for tampering with it." "I thought about that," I admitted. "But what if it's not evidence of a crime? What if it's something personal, something private that Earl had a right to keep hidden? What if opening it and involving the authorities destroys something that was never meant to be found?" James was quiet for a moment. "What does your gut tell you, Dad?" My gut told me that Earl Mackenzie had been a man carrying a heavy burden, a man who'd buried his secrets not because he was ashamed of them, but because he was protecting them. My gut told me that whatever was in that box had been placed there by someone who loved it too much to destroy it, but was too afraid to keep it close. "I think," I said slowly, "I need to open that box and see what Earl was protecting. But I'm not going to do it alone, and I'm not going to do it without being prepared for whatever I might find." The next morning I drove to the Valdosta Police Department and had a conversation with Detective Ray Morrison, a man I'd known since he was a boy playing Little League with my sons. I explained the situation honestly: the buried box, the military connection, the fact that it had been on my property for decades without my knowledge. "Bob," Ray said, leaning back in his chair, "technically anything buried on your property belongs to you, especially if it's been there for more than 20 years. But if you find evidence of a crime, you're legally obligated to report it. And if you find anything that might be considered historical artifacts or military property, there could be federal implications. So what do you suggest?" "I suggest you open it in the presence of a witness, document everything you find, and call me immediately if there's anything that looks illegal or dangerous. And Bob, be careful. People don't bury things in their backyards unless those things are important to them." That afternoon, I called my neighbor Frank Delacroix, a retired sheriff's deputy who'd been a friend for 20 years. Frank agreed to come over that evening to witness whatever we found in Earl Mackenzie's buried box. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my backyard, Frank, Tommy, and I gathered in the garage around the workbench. Max positioned himself near the door, alert and watchful. I had my camera ready to document everything, a notebook to record our findings, and a growing sense that we were about to uncover something that would change everything. "You sure about this, Bob?" Frank asked, adjusting his glasses. "Once that box is open, There's no going back. I looked at Tommy, whose eyes were wide with excitement and nervousness. I looked at Max, whose steady presence reminded me that sometimes the most important discoveries come from following your instincts. And I thought about Earl Mackenzie, a man I'd never met but whose secrets had been hiding beneath my oak tree for nearly 50 years. "I'm sure," I said, and began working on the combination lock. The first number I tried was 1943, the year Earl had been deployed to Europe. Nothing. The second was 1945, the year the war ended. Nothing. The third was 1952, the year he'd bought this property. The lock clicked open. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in plastic bags, were items that took my breath away. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing young soldiers in uniform, smiling faces that would never age, moments of camaraderie frozen in time. There were letters, carefully preserved, addressed to Earl from someone named Sarah. Not my Sarah Beth, but another Sarah, someone who had loved this man enough to write to him every week during the war. But it was the medals that made my hands shake. Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, commendations I didn't recognize, all carefully arranged in a custom case that had obviously been made by someone who understood their value. And beneath the medals, wrapped in a piece of silk that might once have been part of a parachute, was a small leather journal filled with Earl's handwriting. Frank whistled softly. "Bob, these aren't just keepsakes. Some of these medals, these represent serious heroism. Why would a man bury his own decorations?" I opened the journal carefully, and the first page answered Frank's question in Earl's neat script. "If you are reading this, it means I am dead, and someone has finally found my shame. These medals belong to better men than me, men who died because of my mistakes. I cannot bear to look at them, but I cannot bear to throw them away. Maybe someday someone will know what to do with them." Tommy leaned closer, trying to read over my shoulder. "Papa Bob, what does that mean?" I continued reading, and the story that emerged from Earl Mackenzie's journal was one of courage, tragedy, and a guilt that had haunted him for 30 years. Earl had been a squad leader in Italy, responsible for 8 men who looked to him for guidance and protection. During a night patrol in 1944, Earl had made a decision that resulted in his men walking into an ambush. 5 of them had died. Earl had lived, and he had been decorated for his attempts to save them, but in his own mind he had failed the most important test of his life. The letters from Sarah told a different story. Sarah had been Earl's fiancée, and her letters spoke of pride in his service, excitement for his return, plans for their wedding and their future together. But as I read through the correspondence chronologically, I could see the change in Earl's letters to her. The confident, optimistic young man who had left for war had been replaced by someone darker, someone who no longer believed he deserved happiness or love. The last letter in the collection was from Sarah to Earl, dated 1947. In it, she begged him to reconsider his decision to end their engagement, to accept that what happened in Italy wasn't his fault, to allow himself to heal and love and be loved. But Earl had returned the letter to her with a note written across the bottom. "I am not the man you fell in love with. That man died in Italy with his squad." Frank was examining the medals while I read, and his expression grew more somber with each decoration. "Bob," he said quietly, "these medals tell a story of extraordinary bravery. This Purple Heart, these Bronze Stars. Earl Mackenzie wasn't just a soldier. He was a hero. A hero who couldn't forgive himself," I said, closing the journal. "A hero who buried his honors because he thought he didn't deserve them." Tommy had been quietly listening to our conversation, and now he spoke up with the clarity that sometimes comes from young minds uncluttered by adult complications. "Papa Bob, if Mr. Earl saved some of his soldiers but couldn't save all of them, that doesn't make him bad, does it? That makes him brave for trying." Out of the mouths of babes, I thought. My 8-year-old grandson had grasped something that a decorated war veteran had never been able to accept about himself. Over the following days, I found myself obsessed with Earl Mackenzie's story. I researched his unit, the 45th Infantry Division, and learned about the brutal Italian campaign where so many young Americans had died far from home. I contacted the National Archives and discovered Earl's complete service record, which painted a picture of a soldier who had repeatedly volunteered for dangerous missions and had been recommended for commendation by his commanding officers multiple times. But it was the witness statements from the surviving members of Earl's squad that really told the story. According to their accounts, Earl had single-handedly held off enemy forces long enough for 3 of his men to escape the ambush. He had been wounded twice during the firefight, but had refused medical attention until his surviving soldiers were safe. The medals weren't given to him out of pity or protocol. They were given to him because he had earned them through courage and sacrifice. Max seemed to sense the emotional weight of what we'd discovered. His behavior around the box changed from wariness to something that looked almost like reverence. He would lie next to the workbench where I'd arranged Earl's belongings, as if he were standing guard over the memory of a fallen soldier. Frank and I spent hours going through military databases, trying to piece together what had happened to Earl after he'd sold my house in 1978. We found a death certificate dated 1983. Earl Mackenzie had died alone in a Veterans Administration hospital in Atlanta, with no listed next of kin and no known survivors. He had been buried in a small cemetery outside the city, his grave marked with a simple stone that listed only his name and dates of birth and death. "That's not right," Frank said when we found the burial record. "A man with Earl's service record should have been buried with full military honors. He should have had a flag on his coffin and a bugler playing taps. He should have had people there who understood what he'd sacrificed." I stared at the computer screen showing Earl's sparse obituary, and I felt anger building in my chest. Here was a man who had given everything for his country, who had carried the burden of war for nearly 40 years, and who had died forgotten and alone. His medals were buried in my backyard, while he lay in an unmarked grave with nothing to show for his service. That evening, I called Detective Morrison and told him what we'd found. Ray listened quietly as I explained Earl's story, the medals, the journal, and the tragic end to a life marked by undeserved guilt and self-imposed exile. "Bob," Ray said when I finished, "what you've found isn't evidence of a crime. It's evidence of a tragedy. Earl Mackenzie was a war hero who never got the recognition or peace he deserved. The question now is, what are you going to do about it?" I knew what I was going to do. I knew what Earl deserved, what his memory deserved, what the 5 soldiers who died in that Italian ambush deserved. I was going to make sure that Earl Mackenzie's story was told, that his sacrifice was recognized, and that his shame was replaced with the honor he should have received decades ago. The next morning I began making phone calls. I contacted the Veterans Administration, the American Legion, the local VFW post, and every military historian I could find. I told Earl's story to anyone who would listen, shared copies of his journal and service record, and asked for help in giving this forgotten hero the recognition he deserved. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, I had calls from reporters, military officials, and veterans organizations across the state. Earl's story resonated with people who understood the invisible wounds that war can leave, the guilt that survivors sometimes carry, and the importance of honoring those who served. A month later, on a clear Saturday morning in September, more than 200 people gathered at Earl Mackenzie's gravesite in Atlanta. Veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East stood alongside active-duty military personnel, local officials, and civilians who had been moved by Earl's story. The simple stone marker was replaced with a proper military headstone, listing his decorations and years of service. Tommy stood beside me during the ceremony, holding a small American flag and watching with wide eyes as a bugler played taps and an honor guard folded the flag that had draped Earl's memorial. Max sat quietly at my feet, as if he understood the solemnity of the moment. When the ceremony was over, and most of the crowd had dispersed, Frank and I stood alone at Earl's grave with the box that had contained his buried shame. We had decided to donate most of his medals to the local Veterans Museum, where they would be displayed alongside Earl's story and photographs from his service. But I kept his journal with the permission of the military historians who had authenticated it, because I felt that Earl's own words needed to be preserved and shared. "You did a good thing here, Bob," Frank said as we walked back to my truck. "Earl Mackenzie can finally rest in peace." "I didn't do anything special," I replied. "I just followed my dog's instincts and tried to do what was right." That evening, back in my garage, I sat with Max and looked at the empty space on my workbench where Earl's box had been. Tommy came over after dinner, as he did most evenings, eager to hear about the day's events and full of questions about Earl's story. "Papa Bob," he said, settling into his usual spot on the floor beside Max, "do you think Mr. Earl knows what we did for him? Do you think he's happy now?" I looked at my grandson, this bright, curious boy, who had helped uncover a mystery that had been hidden for nearly 50 years, and I thought about the lessons that Earl Mackenzie's story had taught us, about the importance of forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, about the difference between shame and honor, about the way that secrets, even well-intentioned ones, can become burdens that we carry long after they need to be carried. I think, I said, scratching behind Max's ears, that Earl Mackenzie spent 40 years punishing himself for something that wasn't his fault. I think he was a hero who never got the chance to believe it, and I think that sometimes when we're lucky, we get the opportunity to right old wrongs and honor people who deserved better. Tommy nodded solemnly, processing this in the way that children do, accepting the complex truths that adults sometimes struggle to understand. Over the following months, Earl's story continued to resonate. The local newspaper wrote a feature article about the discovery, and several national veterans organizations used his case to highlight the ongoing struggle with post-traumatic stress and survivors' guilt among military personnel. His journal was excerpted in a military history magazine, providing insight into the psychological toll of combat on young soldiers who were expected to be heroes without being given the tools to process what they had experienced. But for me, the most meaningful outcome was personal. Working to restore Earl Mackenzie's honor had reminded me of the importance of not letting guilt and regret define our lives. Sarah Beth had been gone for 4 years, and I had spent much of that time feeling guilty about the things I hadn't said, the places we hadn't traveled, the time I had wasted on trivial concerns, when I should have been cherishing every moment with her. Earl's story taught me that carrying guilt for things beyond our control is a form of dishonor, not just to ourselves, but to the people who loved us and believed in us. Sarah Beth wouldn't have wanted me to spend my remaining years punishing myself for perceived failures as a husband. She would have wanted me to live fully, to find joy in my grandchildren, to continue learning and growing and contributing to the world around me. Max seemed to understand that something had changed in me. His protective vigilance around Earl's box had been replaced by a more relaxed attentiveness to my daily needs. He still followed me everywhere, still offered the silent companionship that had gotten me through the darkest period of my life, but now there was something different in his demeanor. It was as if he too had learned something from our unexpected journey into Earl Mackenzie's buried past. 6 months after we'd found Earl's box, I received a letter that brought the story full circle. It was from a woman named Margaret Phillips, who had seen the newspaper article about Earl's medals and the ceremony at his gravesite. Margaret was the niece of Sarah, Earl's Sarah, the woman whose letters we'd found in the buried box. Margaret's letter explained that her Aunt Sarah had never married after Earl had ended their engagement. She had worked as a teacher for 40 years, had been active in her church and community, and had died in 1989 at the age of 68. But according to Margaret, Sarah had never stopped loving Earl Mackenzie, and she had never stopped hoping that someday he would find peace. "My aunt kept every letter Earl ever sent her," Margaret wrote, "including the one where he ended their engagement. She told me once that she understood why he felt he had to push away everyone who loved him, but that she wished he could have forgiven himself the way she had forgiven him. She said that the Earl Mackenzie she fell in love with wasn't defined by one terrible night in Italy, but by a lifetime of kindness, courage, and devotion to others." Margaret asked if she could visit, if she could see Earl's journal and the letters her aunt had written to him. She wanted to complete the story, to bring together the two halves of a love affair that had been interrupted by war and guilt and the inability of a good man to see his own worth. When Margaret came to visit the following month, she brought with her a shoebox filled with Earl's letters to Sarah, letters that told the story from his perspective. Reading them alongside Sarah's responses created a complete picture of two young people whose lives had been forever changed by circumstances beyond their control. Earl's early letters were full of hope and plans for the future. He wrote about the house he wanted to build for Sarah, the children they would have, the life they would create together after the war. But the later letters, written after the ambush in Italy, showed a man wrestling with demons he couldn't name or understand. "I am not the same person who promised to love you forever," he wrote in one of his final letters to Sarah. "That person died with my men, and what's left isn't worthy of your love or anyone else's. Please don't wait for me, Sarah. Find someone who can give you the happiness you deserve." Tommy was with us when Margaret shared these letters, and once again, his 8-year-old wisdom cut through the complexity of adult emotions. Mr. Earl was wrong. he said simply. He wasn't a different person, he was just hurt really bad and he didn't know how to get better. Margaret smiled at Tommy's observation. Your grandson is very wise, she told me. My Aunt Sarah would have agreed with him completely. Before Margaret left, she asked if she could plant something at the base of the oak tree where we'd found Earl's box. She had brought with her a small rosebush, the same variety that Earl had mentioned in one of his early letters as Sarah's favorite flower. As we knelt together in the rich Georgia soil, planting a living memorial to a love story that had been interrupted but never truly ended, Max watched from the shade of the oak tree. His presence reminded me that some bonds transcend time and circumstances, that loyalty and love can endure even when the objects of that devotion are no longer present. The rosebush took root and flourished, and by the following spring, it was producing beautiful red blooms that filled my backyard with fragrance. Tommy would often sit beneath the oak tree with Max, reading or working on small projects, while the roses bloomed overhead like a benediction on Earl and Sarah's memory. One evening last month, as I sat on my back porch watching the sunset and thinking about all the changes that had come into my life, since that day Tommy and Max had first started digging beneath the oak tree, I realized something important. We hadn't just uncovered Earl Mackenzie's buried shame. We had discovered something valuable about forgiveness, about the importance of bearing witness to other people's pain, and about the way that small acts of kindness can ripple across decades to heal old wounds. Max padded over and rested his head on my knee, his brown eyes reflecting the last light of day. This dog, this faithful companion who had somehow sensed the importance of what lay buried beneath our oak tree, had started us on a journey that had taught me more about grace and redemption than 40 years of Sunday sermons. Tommy came running around the corner of the house, as he did most evenings, full of energy and questions and the kind of boundless curiosity that makes 8-year-olds such excellent detectives. Papa Bob, he said, settling into his favorite chair beside me, do you think there are more buried treasures in our yard? I looked at my grandson, this bright boy, who had helped me uncover not just Earl Mackenzie's story, but something important about the nature of heroism and forgiveness. I looked at Max, whose instincts had guided us to a discovery that had changed multiple lives, and I looked at the rosebush blooming beneath the oak tree, a living reminder that love can endure even the most difficult circumstances. Tommy, I said, I think we've found the most important treasure there is. We've learned that sometimes the most valuable things aren't gold or money or precious stones. Sometimes they're stories that need to be told, honors that need to be restored, and memories that need to be preserved. But what if there are more boxes? Tommy persisted. What if there are more stories buried somewhere? I smiled, remembering my grandfather's words about dogs and their ability to sense things that humans miss. Well, I said, scratching behind Max's ears, I guess we'll just have to keep our eyes open and trust Max to let us know if he finds anything else worth digging for. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I thought about Earl Mackenzie, sleeping peacefully now in his properly marked grave. I thought about Sarah, who had loved him enough to wait 40 years for a reunion that never came in this world. I thought about the 5 soldiers who had died in that Italian ambush, their sacrifice finally honored along with their squad leader's heroism. But mostly, I thought about the lessons that this unexpected journey had taught me, about the importance of not judging people by their worst moments, about the difference between guilt and responsibility, about the way that secrets can become prisons, and how sometimes the most healing thing we can do is to bring those secrets into the light. Max stirred against my knee, and I looked down at him with the kind of gratitude that comes from recognizing a true partner. This dog had been my guide through the darkest period of my life after Sarah Beth's death, and he had been my compass during the adventure of uncovering Earl Mackenzie's story. His loyalty, his instincts, and his unwavering presence had reminded me that some bonds are unbreakable, that some companions can be trusted completely, and that sometimes the most important discoveries come from following your heart rather than your head. Tommy yawned, tired after another day of exploring and questioning and learning. Soon his parents would come to collect him, and Max and I would have our quiet evening routine of checking the doors, turning off the lights, and settling in for another night in the house that had become home to so many stories. But before that happened, I wanted to share one more thing with my grandson, something important that I'd learned from Earl Mackenzie's buried shame and his posthumous redemption. Tommy, I said, remember how Mr. Earl spent all those years thinking he wasn't a hero because he couldn't save all of his soldiers. Tommy nodded, his attention focused on my words despite his tiredness. Sometimes people make mistakes or have bad things happen to them, and they think that defines who they are. But Earl's story teaches us that one bad day, one terrible moment, doesn't erase a lifetime of good choices and brave actions. The important thing is to learn from our mistakes, try to make things right when we can, and not let guilt keep us from living the rest of our lives. Like how you stopped being so sad about Grandma Sarah Beth, Tommy asked, with the directness that children possess. I was quiet for a moment, surprised by his perception but not really shocked. Children see more than adults often realize, and Tommy had been watching me carefully during these months of discovery and healing. Yes, I said finally. Like that. Grandma Sarah Beth wouldn't have wanted me to spend the rest of my life feeling guilty about things I couldn't change. She would have wanted me to remember the good times, take care of the people I love, and keep finding reasons to smile. Tommy smiled up at me, satisfied with this explanation. And Max helped with that too, didn't he? Max helped with everything, I said, giving the dog an extra pat. Good dogs have a way of knowing what we need before we know it ourselves. As if on cue, Max's tail thumped against the porch floor, and he looked up at both of us with the kind of contentment that comes from a job well done. Now, as I sit here in the evening quiet with Max at my feet and the scent of Sarah's roses drifting through the air, I find myself thinking about the nature of discovery. We set out to solve a simple mystery, what was buried beneath our oak tree, and ended up uncovering something much more valuable than we could have imagined. We discovered that heroism isn't about being perfect or saving everyone. It's about doing your best in impossible circumstances and continuing to serve others, even when you're carrying wounds that may never fully heal. We discovered that love can endure separation, misunderstanding, and even death. Sarah's letters to Earl, written more than 70 years ago, still had the power to move people to tears and inspire acts of kindness. We discovered that shame is often misplaced, that the people who carry the heaviest burdens of guilt are frequently the ones who deserve it least. Most importantly, we discovered that bearing witness to other people's pain and working to restore their honor when possible is one of the most meaningful things we can do with our lives. If you're reading this story, or listening to it while you drive to work or walk your dog or sit on your own back porch watching the sunset, I want you to know that Tommy, Max, and I didn't set out to become heroes or to change anyone's life. We just followed our curiosity, trusted our instincts, and tried to do the right thing when we were faced with someone else's buried pain. But maybe that's what heroism really is. Maybe it's not about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Maybe it's about paying attention to the mysteries that surround us, listening when our dogs try to tell us something important, and having the courage to dig deeper when we encounter something that doesn't seem right. Earl Mackenzie taught me that the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build for ourselves out of guilt and shame. His story reminded me that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, isn't just a nice idea. It's a necessary component of a life fully lived. Have you ever been through something like this? Have you ever discovered that someone you knew was carrying a burden they didn't deserve, or found yourself holding on to guilt for things that were beyond your control? Have you ever had a moment when your dog, or your grandchild, or your own instincts led you to something that changed your understanding of what's important? I'd love to hear about it. Because I've learned that these stories of buried shame transformed into restored honor, stories of love that endures beyond understanding, stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because it's the right thing to do. These are the stories that connect us to each other and remind us of our shared humanity. Tell me about your buried treasures, the ones you've found and the ones you've helped others discover. Tell me about the times when following your heart led you somewhere you never expected to go. Because in the end, those are the stories that matter most. The stories of people like Earl Mackenzie, like Sarah, like Tommy and Max, and all of us who are just trying to do our best in a complicated world, one small act of courage at a time.